Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Right now, beneath the streets of Mexico City, the ground is literally compressing so fast that this sprawling metropolis, I mean, we're talking 9 million people here, it's sinking nearly a foot a year.
Yeah, 10 inches to be exact. It's a slow motion structural collapse, and you can actually see it happening from space.
From space.
Yeah.
Which is just wild to think about. And meanwhile, up above our heads, the United States military is actively drawing up plans for this Golden Dome, which is a constellation of orbital interceptors designed to literally shoot down missiles from the vacuum of space.
Right. And so we're sitting here today trying to make sense of this global map where the battleground, and I mean the literal physical battleground for the future, it's stretching all the way from these crushed aquifers at the center of the Earth right up to the crowded orbits of the stars.
It is, it's a pretty phenomenal time to be paying attention, honestly. The traditional borders, like the lines we draw on a map to separate countries, or even the lines we draw in academia to separate, say, physics from economics, they are completely dissolving.
Oh, absolutely. You really can't understand a war in the Middle East right now without understanding the molecular chemistry of agricultural fertilizer.
Right.
And you can't understand the stock market without grasping the weird mathematical quirks of artificial intelligence training. The world has just become this singular, highly reactive organism.
And that is exactly what we're here to explore today. So welcome to today's deep dive. It is Friday, May 1st, 2026. And to you, the listener, we are just thrilled you're joining us.
We really are.
Our mission today is basically to act as your shortcut. We want to make you deeply, comprehensively well-informed without you having to read 1,000 articles. So we've synthesized this massive stack of global journalism, pulling from international mainstream media, peer-reviewed scientific journals, on-the-ground reporting, you name it.
Yeah, and we're looking at this rapidly shifting landscape from multiple, sometimes totally conflicting perspectives. Because, let's be honest, in a world this noisy, context isn't just helpful anymore.
No, it's survival.
Precisely. If you only look at the headlines, you're just going to get whiplash. You have to look at the underlying mechanisms, like why are these things happening and how do they actually work? Because that is where the real insight lives.
So let's start with the ground we're supposedly standing on, or, at least the economy we were all participating in.
Right.
If you look at the financial press this week, you see this bizarre, I'd almost call it schizophrenic, dichotomy in the global markets.
Yeah, dichotomy is the right word.
Because on one hand, you have the S&P 500 hitting these record highs. You look at the ticker tape and it's just a sea of green.
Yeah.
Analysts are on TV talking about this historic unstoppable boom. But then you dig into the actual macroeconomic data for the United States, and the reality is, well, it's far more fragile.
Fragile is the perfect word for it, because the headline number that everyone is touting is that the U.S. economy grew at 2% in the first quarter of 2026.
Which sounds okay, right?
Right. I mean, 2% growth is generally considered stable. But when you disaggregate that number, when you actually break it apart, you realize it is essentially a two-pillar economy right now. That growth is being driven almost entirely by this massive, unprecedented capital investment into artificial intelligence infrastructure, coupled with, sustained government spending.
Right. So the tech giants are basically just buying up every single microchip they can get their hands on, and the government is spending heavily on defense and infrastructure. But what about the rest of us, what about the actual engine of the American economy?
Well, that is exactly where the vulnerability lies. Consumer spending, which historically accounts for roughly 2/3 of the U.S. economy.
Wow, 2/3.
Yeah, it's huge. And that spending is slowing down significantly right now. People are exhausting their pandemic savings, and the everyday consumer is just feeling the compounding pinch of persistent inflation, really elevated housing costs, and, crucially, rising energy prices.
I was actually trying to visualize this earlier, and the image that kept coming to mind is this house. We are basically looking at a house with a brand new, gleaming, solid gold roof. And that roof is the stock market and the AI boom.
I like that.
Right, because it looks incredibly wealthy from a distance. But if you walk up to the house, the foundation is actively cracking because the actual homeowners inside are skipping meals just to pay the electric bill. those top-line numbers are masking a really profound microeconomic tightening.
That is a highly accurate visualization, honestly. The wealth effect right now is highly, highly concentrated. And one of the primary pressures that's cracking that foundation is the global energy market, which, as we know, is incredibly sensitive to geopolitical tremors.
Tremors is putting it mildly.
Right. The ongoing conflict involving Iran in the Middle East right now has pushed global oil prices to a 4-year high.
And oil is just the ultimate domino. It hits the gas pump, sure, but it also hits the cost of manufacturing. Literally every plastic good, the cost of flying every single cargo plane, sailing every container ship. And you can tell the global financial institutions are sweating about this.
Oh, they definitely are.
Because the Bank of England just held their interest rates at 3.75%. And the notes they released explicitly stated that they're holding that rate specifically to monitor the economic fallout of this Middle Eastern crisis. They're essentially, waiting to see if this oil spike is going to trigger a secondary wave of global inflation before they even dare to cut rates.
And if we follow that domino effect, it leads us to something far more critical than just interest rates. It leads directly to the global food supply.
This is the part that really scared me.
Yeah, it should. This week, the CEO of Yara, which, if you don't know, is this massive Norwegian chemical company, one of the world's largest producers of agricultural fertilizers, he issued this stark, terrifying warning. He stated that the regional conflict could trigger a global fertilizer shortage that puts, in his exact words, billions of meals at risk worldwide.
Okay, I need to pause you right there, because I think this is a huge blind spot for a lot of people, myself definitely included. How does a conflict in the Middle East translate to empty dinner plates in, entirely different hemispheres?
Right. The connection isn't obvious.
Because I think most of us intuitively know, okay, plants need water and sunlight, and maybe we picture fertilizer as compost or manure. Break down the actual modern industrial fertilizer to food pipeline for me. How are those two things mechanically linked?
Okay, so it all revolves around what is arguably the most vital chemical process on Earth. It's called the Haber-Bosch process.
Haber-Bosch.
Yes. Modern global agriculture, the literal system that sustains 8 billion human beings right now, is entirely dependent on synthetic nitrogen-based fertilizers. Without them, billions of people starve. Period.
Wow, okay.
And to make those synthetic fertilizers, you need to pull nitrogen out of the air. But atmospheric nitrogen gas is incredibly stable. It just doesn't want to react with anything. So to force it to react and create ammonia, you need massive heat, massive pressure, and a source of hydrogen.
Okay, and where do we get the hydrogen?
From natural gas.
Yeah.
Methane. The industrial production of fertilizer is essentially a petrochemical process. You take natural gas, you crack it in a facility to get the hydrogen, and then you bind it with atmospheric nitrogen. Therefore, a synthetic fertilizer is basically just embodied natural gas.
Oh, wow. So no natural gas, no ammonia.
And no ammonia.
No fertilizer.
Precisely. And the Middle East is obviously a primary global hub for petroleum and natural gas extraction. Plus, the surrounding waters, like the Strait of Hormuz, are critical shipping arteries.
Right.
When conflict threatens the physical infrastructure of those gas fields, or threatens to trap the ships carrying the liquefied natural gas, the global price of natural gas skyrockets. And suddenly, a fertilizer plant in Germany or India or Brazil can no longer afford the raw materials to run their kilns. So what do? They shut down production.
And then the cascade begins. The global supply of fertilizer drops, so the price of fertilizer doubles, maybe triples. And then what? A farmer in Kansas or Ukraine looks at their spreadsheet and realizes they literally can't afford to fertilize their entire crop, so they just use half as much. And what happens next?
The crop yields plummet. A year later, the global grain silos are running at a massive deficit. The global commodities market panics, wheat and corn futures spike, and suddenly the price of a loaf of bread in Tokyo or a tortilla in Mexico City doubles.
It's an invisible chain.
Exactly. It's an unbreakable chemical chain linking a geopolitical standoff in the Persian Gulf directly to the caloric intake of a family on the other side of the planet.
Which makes the political stakes of resolving these conflicts almost unimaginably high. And right now, the handling of this specific conflict is sparking this massive, ongoing constitutional debate within the United States government.
It really is.
And just to report on this completely and neutrally, based on the political journalism we're seeing today, there is a very deep divide over the War Powers Act.
Yes. So recently, there has been a temporary ceasefire or a truce in the region. And the current U.S. President, Donald Trump, and his White House administration have issued legal guidance stating that this cessation of active hostilities essentially resets the parameters of the War Powers Act.
Resetting the clock, basically.
Right. Their interpretation is that because the sustained combat has paused, the clock stops on the constitutional requirement for the executive branch to seek formal congressional approval to maintain a military posture or take rapid retaliatory actions in the region.
So the argument there is essentially, the war paused. Therefore, the 60-day countdown for congressional authorization is no longer ticking, giving the commander-in-chief maximum flexibility to respond to rapidly changing threats.
Correct. That's the administration's stance. But on the other side of the aisle, Democratic senators are pushing back incredibly forcefully against this legal framework. They're arguing that a temporary operational pause does not somehow negate the foundational constitutional requirement.
Right.
Their stance is that the underlying deployment of forces in a hostile zone still requires explicit debated authorization from the legislative branch. They're saying that allowing a truce to bypass Congress sets a really dangerous precedent for open-ended, unilateral executive military action.
It is the classic centuries-old tension between the executive and legislative branches regarding who truly holds the power to wage war, but it's playing out in real time, with the global energy and food supply literally hanging in the balance. And, speaking of the power dynamics in the Middle East energy sector, we really have to talk about the United Arab Emirates, because the global financial media is reporting that the UAE has strongly signaled its exit from OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries.
This is a geopolitical earthquake. It really is. For decades, OPEC has operated as a wildly powerful cartel. The member nations gather, they assess global demand, and they set strict production quotas for each country.
Right, keeping the supply constrained.
Exactly. By artificially constraining the supply of oil, they keep the global price elevated, which maximizes their revenues and gives them tremendous geopolitical leverage over the rest of the world.
But by signaling an exit, the UAE is basically saying, hey, we're no longer playing by the collective rules. We want to pump as much as we want when we want. And the reports indicate this could immediately free up, like, 1 million barrels a day of spare capacity onto the global market. But why would the UAE blow up the cartel that has made them so incredibly wealthy?
It really comes down to long-term survival in a changing world. The UAE is looking at the global push toward electrification and renewable energy. They realize that the era of fossil fuels, while it's far from over, it has a visible horizon now.
The clock is ticking.
Exactly. They have massive oil reserves just sitting in the ground. If they wait too long, bound by OPEC's slow drip of production quotas, those reserves could eventually become stranded assets as global demand permanently peaks and then declines.
Ah, I see. So it's literally a race against the clock. They want to monetize their oil right now at maximum volume to basically fund their national transition into a post-oil economy.
Yeah.
Investing in tech, tourism, building up their sovereign wealth funds.
That's the strategy. But if the UAE breaks the dam, what stops other major producers from doing the exact same thing? It raises really serious questions about the long-term viability of OPEC as a cohesive entity. We could be entering a fractured, highly competitive era where nations just flood the market to cash out, which would lead to wild volatility in energy prices.
Wow. So we have this intense maneuvering over physical resources, the oil, the gas, the minerals for fertilizer. But there is a second Cold War happening concurrently. And this one isn't fought over what is under the ground. It's fought over what is in the cloud. It is a battle for data, for silicon and artificial intelligence.
The physical resources power the world today, but the digital resources dictate who will control the world tomorrow. And the borders of that digital world are slamming shut. I mean, just look at the recent unanimous vote from the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC.
Right.
They have officially banned Chinese telecommunications labs from testing electronics destined for the U.S. market, citing severe national security concerns.
Yeah, and they also formally barred specific Chinese telecommunications companies from operating or leasing data centers within the United States. Now, the data center ban, that makes intuitive sense to me. You obviously don't want a foreign adversary having physical access to the servers hosting your banking data or health records.
Absolutely.
But I read the electronics testing ban, and I really struggled to understand the threat there. Like, if I design a smartphone in California, why is it a massive national security vulnerability to send a prototype to a lab in Shenzhen just to test if I don't know, the battery meets fire safety standards, or if the Wi-Fi antenna complies with radio regulations.
Because to truly test a modern device, you don't just put it in a hot room and see if it melts. You have to interface with its deepest, most fundamental software. A testing lab requires what is known in computer science as ring zero or kernel-level access.
Ring 0.
Yes. They are probing the firmware, the microcode, the absolute bedrock of the operating system that controls the hardware itself.
So it's basically the software that tells the microchip how to be a microchip.
Precisely. It's the foundation of everything. If a state-sponsored actor has that level of unrestricted access to a prototype's architecture, they aren't just testing it. They have the opportunity to map all of its vulnerabilities. Or, even worse, they can quietly insert a backdoor, which is a dormant, invisible piece of code buried so deep in the firmware that standard antivirus software will just never see it.
Because the antivirus is running on top of the infected foundation.
Exactly. And once that device goes into mass production and is sitting in the pockets of millions of Americans or, on the desks of government officials, that backdoor can be activated remotely. They can siphon data, intercept communications, or just brick the device entirely. So the FCC ban is a very aggressive move to de-risk the hardware supply chain at its genesis point.
That is genuinely terrifying.
Yeah.
It's not just about stopping a spy from stealing the blueprints. It's about stopping them from poisoning the well before the water is even drawn. And while the U.S. is playing heavy defense on the hardware side, the international reporting shows China is mounting a massive offense on software, heavily subsidizing its domestic AI sector.
The scale of their investment is staggering. One really fascinating example highlighted in the global press this week is a company called Viglu. They are explicitly transforming China's microdrama entertainment industry.
Microdramas.
Yeah, these are bite-sized, highly addictive soap operas designed specifically for mobile phones. They're huge over there. Viglu is using state-backed AI workflows to basically generate scripts, synthesize the actors' voices, and even generate full video content at an industrial scale.
Just pumping out infinite content.
Right. It is a cultural push flooding the zone with AI-generated media, just as much as it is a technological one.
They're essentially automating Hollywood. And this actually brings us to the corporate AI battles happening right now, which are getting incredibly thorny from a legal perspective. The tech press is buzzing about recent court testimony from Elon Musk. He stated on the record that his AI company, xAI, trained its new Grok model using a technique called distillation.
Yes.
And they distilled it directly from the outputs of OpenAI's models.
This is perhaps the most fiercely debated topic in computer science right now. Knowledge distillation. Because to understand the controversy, you have to understand the sheer cost of building a frontier model from scratch.
It's not cheap.
No, not at all. When OpenAI builds a massive system like GPT-4, it requires billions of dollars, tens of thousands of specialized microchips running continuously for months, and an unfathomable amount of electricity just to crunch through petabytes of raw internet data.
Okay, so that's the traditional brute force training method. Where does distillation come in?
Distillation is a shortcut. Instead of forcing a new, smaller student model to read the entire internet and painstakingly learn how language works through trial and error, you simply hook it up to the fully trained teacher model. You feed the teacher millions of complex prompts, and the student model basically just observes how the teacher responds.
Like it's looking over its shoulder.
Yes. It analyzes the mathematical probability distributions, which are called logits, that the teacher uses to select the next word. The student essentially reverse engineers the teacher's intelligence without doing the hard work of learning it from scratch.
I read about this, and my initial thought was immediately copyright infringement. Like if I copy your proprietary code, I get sued. But distillation sounds almost like a legal loophole. It's like, okay, imagine OpenAI spent years and billions of dollars writing a massive, complex encyclopedia.
Okay.
And then xAI bought a copy, read it, and wrote a highly efficient Cliffs Notes version of it, and now they're selling it. Is that a fair analogy?
It's close, but it actually understates the complexity of what's happening. It's less like writing Cliffs Notes and more like an apprentice watching a grandmaster chess player.
Oh, interesting.
The apprentice doesn't need to play 10,000 agonizing losing games to learn the underlying strategy, right? They just sit and study the grandmaster's final board setups and reverse engineer the winning moves. xAI is letting their Grok model watch OpenAI's winning moves and entirely skipping the billion-dollar trial and error phase.
But how is that not legally theft? I mean, OpenAI poured the capital into creating the Grandmaster. Does xAI really have the right to use that Grandmaster to train a direct competitor?
That is the exact question the courts are going to have to answer, and there is virtually no legal precedent for it. Where is the legal line between an algorithm learning from a product's output and stealing its underlying intellectual property? The AI companies are aggressively trying to pull up the ladders behind them to protect their massive investments.
And the hypocrisy in the industry is wild. You have these tech giants complaining about their competitors restricting access, only to turn around and do the exact same thing a week later.
It's a constant cycle.
The reporting notes that OpenAI is currently restricting access to its new GPT 5.5 cyber tool. They are only granting access to what they call critical defenders, citing severe safety and proliferation concerns. But literally just recently, OpenAI executives were publicly criticizing their competitor, Anthropic, for limiting access to their model, Mythos.
It really highlights the dual-use nature of frontier AI, particularly in cybersecurity. A model sophisticated enough to autonomously scan a power grid's network and identify a zero-day vulnerability can obviously be used defensively to patch that hole.
Great.
But if that same model falls into the hands of a hostile state actor, it can be used offensively to exploit the hole and shut off the power. As these models approach human-level reasoning in specific domains, the private corporations building them are functionally becoming global security arbiters. They're the ones deciding who gets the digital weapons and who doesn't.
Which is an immense, almost sovereign level of power for a few CEOs to hold. So we've got terrestrial borders closing over oil and natural gas, and digital borders closing over AI and data centers. Where does the geopolitical competition go next? It goes up, directly into orbit. Let's pivot to the militarization and exploration of space.
Space right now is defined by a sharp, really unsettling contrast. You have international scientific collaboration on one hand and rapid, unvarnished militarization on the other. On the military front, the U.S. Space Force is aggressively advancing an initiative known as the Golden Dome.
Right.
Their stated goal is to deploy a constellation of space-based missile interceptors by the year 2028 to counter emerging ballistic threats from nations like Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK.
The Golden Dome.
Yeah.
Sounds like science fiction. Let's unpack the physics of this, because I want to understand why we need weapons in space when we already have missile defense systems on the ground. How does a space-based interceptor fundamentally change the math of missile defense?
It changes the geometry of the interception entirely. Traditional ground-based or sea-based missile defense systems, like the Patriot or the Aegis systems, they rely on intercepting an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, during its mid-course phase in the vacuum of space, or its terminal phase as it re-enters the atmosphere at incredible speeds.
Right, which sounds incredibly difficult.
It is the engineering equivalent of trying to hit a bullet with another bullet while both are traveling at Mach 20 in the dark. It is mathematically possible, but highly prone to failure. The Golden Dome concept flips the paradigm. By placing interceptors already up there in low Earth orbit, the goal is to strike the hostile ICBM during its boost phase.
The boost phase, so that's the first few minutes right after it launches from the launch pad.
Exactly. During the boost phase, the ICBM is fighting gravity. It is relatively slow. It is emitting this massive, blindingly obvious thermal plume that is incredibly easy for infrared sensors to track. And most importantly, it is a fragile, highly pressurized tube filled with thousands of gallons of explosive rocket fuel.
A flying bomb.
Right. A kinetic kill vehicle dropped from orbit doesn't even need explosive warheads. Just the physical impact at orbital velocities is enough to shatter the ICBM over the territory of the nation that launched it.
So it's infinitely easier to kill the missile while it's still lumbering off the ground. But to do that, you have to be physically positioned directly above the launch site at the exact moment of launch. Since the Earth rotates, you can't just park one satellite over North Korea. You would need a continuous, moving web of interceptors circling the globe to ensure one is always in position.
Precisely. You need a massive constellation. And the geopolitical implications of that are staggering. For 70 years, global peace has been maintained by the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the grim guarantee that if you launch a nuclear strike, you will be destroyed in return.
MAD.
Right. If one nation deploys a functional Golden Dome, they theoretically acquire the ability to launch a first strike without fear of retaliation because they can swat down the counterattack in the boost phase. It completely destabilizes the nuclear calculus. It makes space an active theater of war.
And it is very clear other nations are not simply watching this happen. The aerospace journals are reporting that Russia just successfully test-launched its homegrown Soyuz 5 medium-lift rocket from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The reporting makes it clear this is explicitly aimed at replacing older, legacy Soviet tech and completely bypassing Western aerospace sanctions. They are proving they can maintain a sovereign, isolated capability to reach orbit.
The militarization is accelerating, but if you look at the civilian exploration side, we are seeing significant friction. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, recently confirmed that the Artemis 3 mission, which is the highly anticipated mission meant to return human astronauts to the lunar surface, has been officially delayed to late 2027.
That's a big delay.
It is. And aerospace analysts are noting that this delay severely threatens the overall programmatic goal of establishing a sustained lunar presence by 2028.
The reports say these delays are largely tied to the incredibly complex development of the commercial human landing systems. Which brings up a very obvious question in my mind. If we, as a species, are struggling this mightily just to build a reliable lander to get astronauts back to the surface of the moon by 2028, a place we successfully navigated over 50 years ago, how on earth is it realistic that the Space Force can engineer, manufacture, launch, and reliably command a massive Golden Dome constellation of orbital weapons by that exact same year? It feels like a massive disconnect in expectations.
It is more than a valid question, and it really exposes a vast rift in how we fund and execute aerospace projects. You have to look at the differing engineering constraints. Building a lunar lander for humans requires life support systems, radiation shielding, redundant human rating safety standards, and the ability to perform complex orbital rendezvous maneuvers. It is an exquisitely delicate machine. A kinetic interceptor, by contrast, is essentially a very fast, very smart rock with a guidance computer. It doesn't need to keep anyone alive.
I see the logic there. A smart rock is easier than a habitat.
However, even accepting that a smart rock is simpler than a lunar habitat, the logistics of mass-producing and deploying an entire, reliable constellation of interceptors in a 4-year window borders on the overly optimistic, if not outright science fiction. The sheer launch cadence required would monopolize the entire global launch market.
But despite the Artemis delays, the physical hardware of the civilian program is undeniably moving. We saw reporting that the colossal SLS, the Space Launch System core stage, was just transported 900 miles via the Pegasus barge from the manufacturing facility in New Orleans to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The sheer scale of moving a rocket the size of a skyscraper on a barge is mind-bending.
It's a massive undertaking.
And the diplomatic architecture for space is advancing too. Morocco just formally became the 64th signatory of the Artemis Accords.
The Artemis Accords represent the optimistic, collaborative side of our future in space. They are a U.S.-led, multinational framework establishing peaceful norms of behavior for lunar exploration and beyond. They codify principles like transparency, the interoperability of hardware, meaning an American astronaut could theoretically plug their suit into a European or Moroccan habitat, and the open sharing of scientific data.
That's really encouraging.
It is. Seeing a nation like Morocco join demonstrates a robust global appetite to ensure space remains a domain of shared scientific heritage rather than just a battlefield.
And it is getting incredibly crowded up there.
Yeah.
The news cycle this week featured these absolutely stunning satellite photos of a recent SpaceX Falcon Heavy launch. But what made these photos go viral is that they were taken from space by another satellite, looking down at the rocket as it ascended through the atmosphere.
It is a profound visual shift. We are so used to looking up at rockets.
Right. But seeing it from above, looking down at the exhaust plume stretching across the curve of the Earth, is a visceral reminder of how busy our orbital environment has become. The sky is full of eyes. You simply cannot hide a rocket launch anymore. The situational awareness is total.
And while the aerospace engineers are looking up at the macro scale, trying to solve the massive physics problems of rocketry and orbital dynamics, there is another group of scientists looking in the exact opposite direction. They are looking down, through electron microscopes, at the microscopic and molecular level, attempting to solve our terrestrial resource bottlenecks.
This is where the science gets truly mind-bending. Because earlier, we talked at length about the geopolitical leverage of physical materials, the oil, the natural gas for fertilizer, the rare earth metals needed for high-tech manufacturing. Entire nations hold the global economy hostage because they happen to sit on top of these deposits. But what if you could just engineer your way out of needing those specific materials entirely? What if you could build them from scratch?
That is the promise of advanced material science. And this week, researchers at King's College London published a paper detailing the synthesis of a novel aluminum compound. By forcing the aluminum atoms into a specific triangular molecular structure, they have created a material that can functionally replace incredibly expensive and geopolitically sensitive rare earth metals in industrial applications.
Okay, let's slow down and look at the chemistry here. Aluminum is everywhere. It's cheap, it's abundant, we wrap our leftovers in it. Why doesn't standard aluminum work for advanced electronics, and how does forcing it into a triangle change its fundamental nature?
In its natural standard molecular lattice, which is a face-centered cubic structure, aluminum is light and conductive, but it lacks the specific electron configurations required to act as a high-efficiency catalyst. High-tech manufacturing things like the catalytic converters in cars, the advanced circuitry in smartphones, or the specialized components in green energy turbines relies heavily on elements like palladium, platinum, or neodymium.
The expensive stuff.
Right. These are the rare earth and platinum group metals. They have unique electron clouds that make chemical reactions happen faster and more efficiently.
And as the name implies, they are rare, very expensive to mine, and the global supply chain is heavily dominated by a few nations, most notably China.
Exactly. But the researchers at King's College realized that the properties of a metal aren't just dictated by what atoms it contains, but by how those atoms are arranged. By utilizing complex chemical synthesis to force the aluminum atoms into a tight, strained, triangular ring, they fundamentally altered the density and distribution of the electrons. They essentially tricked the cheap, abundant aluminum into mimicking the electron behavior of a rare, expensive metal.
That is incredible. If we connect this back to the tech Cold War we discussed earlier, if a country can suddenly manufacture the catalysts they need for advanced microchips using engineered aluminum synthesized in a local lab, rather than relying on rare earth metals imported from a geopolitical rival, how does that shift the global power dynamic?
It is the ultimate disruptive technology. It completely scrambles the supply chain chessboard. If you can engineer the properties you need out of common elements, you neutralize the leverage of the nations that mine the rare ones. It democratizes advanced manufacturing and essentially invalidates the traditional geopolitical map of resource wealth.
From manipulating molecular shapes, we move to manipulating the very fabric of reality itself. Physicists at the University of Oxford have published a paper detailing a successful experiment achieving what they call quad squeezing. The journal describes it as a first-of-its-kind, fourth-order quantum effect achieved using trapped ions. Now, I consider myself a relatively informed person, but reading this paper gave me vertigo.
It's extremely dense.
We need to step away from the dense physics jargon. What in the world is standard quantum squeezing, and what makes quad squeezing a breakthrough?
It is incredibly abstract, but we can use a conceptual model. We have to start with Werner Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. At the quantum level, the universe refuses to let you know everything about a particle at once. There are paired properties, like the position of a particle and its momentum. The more precisely you measure its position, the more wildly uncertain its momentum becomes.
Right. The act of measuring one thing blurs the other.
Exactly. Imagine that baseline, unavoidable quantum uncertainty as a balloon filled with a specific amount of water. The total volume of that balloon is the minimum uncertainty allowed by the laws of physics.
Okay, I have the balloon in my hands.
Standard quantum squeezing is exactly what it sounds like. Using highly calibrated lasers, physicists can squeeze that balloon. If you press your hands together, the balloon gets much narrower in one direction, meaning you have dramatically reduced the uncertainty in, say, the particle's position. You know exactly where it is. But the water has to go somewhere, so the balloon bulges out wildly at the top and bottom. You have sacrificed your knowledge of its momentum to gain extreme precision about its position.
You squeeze the noise out of the metric you care about and dumped it into the metric you don't care about. And that is useful.
Immensely useful. Standard squeezing is the technology that allows the LIGO Observatory to detect the unimaginably faint gravitational waves from colliding black holes. It's how the most accurate atomic clocks function.
Okay, so if that is standard squeezing, what did Oxford do with quad squeezing?
Quad squeezing takes this manipulation into a fourth-order mathematical dimension. They are using trapped ions, which involves taking individual electrically charged atoms, isolating them in a perfect ultra-high vacuum, and literally suspending them in midair using oscillating electromagnetic fields. They are holding single atoms perfectly still.
Just casually levitating an atom.
Yes. And then, by pulsing those levitated atoms with incredibly precise, custom-tailored laser frequencies, they aren't just squeezing the uncertainty balloon in two directions, they are mathematically folding and contorting the probability space of the atom into shapes that were previously considered purely theoretical. They are accessing deeper, highly complex states of quantum noise manipulation.
It just blows my mind. We are using lasers to fold the fabric of probability around a levitating atom. It makes you feel like humanity has reached the absolute apex of intelligence. We are masters of the quantum realm. But then, you turn the page in the scientific journals, and the archaeologists tap us on the shoulder to remind us that our ancient ancestors were engineering complex chemistry long before we even knew what an atom was. Let's look at the past for a moment.
Yes, the archaeological record is constantly forcing us to revise our timeline of human sophistication. A perfect example emerged this week regarding the history of plaster.
Right. When we think of ancient engineering, we immediately think of the Roman Empire. The Romans are historically credited with mastering concrete and plaster, using it to build aqueducts, the Pantheon, and the sprawling infrastructure of their empire. But new excavations at Neolithic sites, specifically a site called Motza located near Jerusalem, Israel, have completely upended that timeline. Archaeologists have found evidence of advanced plaster technology dating back 10,000 years. That is 8,000 years before the Roman Empire even existed.
The time frame is staggering, but what's truly fascinating is the chemistry involved. Making true architectural plaster is not simply a matter of mixing river mud and water and letting it dry in the sun. It requires a highly specific industrial process known as calcination.
Break down calcination for me. What are the Neolithic people actually doing 10,000 years ago?
They are mining limestone, which is primarily calcium carbonate. To turn limestone into plaster, you have to heat it to roughly 900 degrees Celsius, and you have to sustain that intense heat for days. This chemical reaction drives off the carbon dioxide, transforming the stone into calcium oxide, or quicklime.
And quicklime is dangerous, right?
Highly caustic and unstable. You then have to carefully rehydrate it, a process called slaking, which creates an intense exothermic reaction, boiling the water. Only after it settles do you have slaked lime, which can be mixed with sand to create a durable plaster that eventually reabsorbs carbon dioxide from the air to turn back into a hard limestone layer on your wall or floor.
That is an incredibly complex, dangerous, multi-step chemical synthesis. You need to understand thermodynamics to design a kiln that can reach 900 degrees. You need fuel management. You need chemical intuition. And these were Neolithic communities. These are people living long before the invention of the wheel, long before metallurgy, long before any written language existed to pass down instructions.
Exactly. At the Motza site, they weren't just using it for utilitarian floors either. They were using this advanced material science for intricate ceremonial purposes, such as modeling lifelike facial features over human skulls for ancestral worship. It demonstrates a profound empirical mastery of material science that was driven by cultural or religious needs, not just basic survival.
It completely reframes how I view history. If we credited the Romans with the invention of plaster for centuries, and we were out by 8 millennia, what else are we wrong about? Are we chronically underestimating the intellectual capacity of ancient humanity simply because their tools were made of stone instead of steel?
We almost certainly are. The fundamental problem with archaeology is survivorship bias. We can only study the materials that do not decay. Stone, pottery, and calcined plaster survive for 10,000 years. Wood, leather, textiles, and whatever brilliant mechanisms they built from organic materials rot away, leaving us with a severely fragmented picture of their true capabilities.
And it is not just human history that is proving to be more complex and nonlinear than we originally theorized. It is the entire biological history of life on Earth. The paleontological journals are buzzing about a discovery out of Brazil. Researchers have found the fossilized remains of a creature named Tanica amnicola. It is a 275 million-year-old animal from the Permian period, and it possesses a bizarre, twisted jaw structure that is unlike anything alive on the planet today.
The twisted jaw is the evolutionary Rosetta Stone of this fossil. For a very long time, the popularized textbook version of evolution was presented as a straight ladder of progress. A fish bravely crawled out of the ocean, gradually grew sturdy legs, turned into a reptile, which eventually turned into a mammal. It implied a clear, directed path of improvement.
The classic illustration of the ape slowly standing up to become a man.
Precisely. But Tanica amnicola fundamentally challenges that linear narrative. This creature lived during the critical evolutionary transition when aquatic life was first attempting to permanently conquer the land. But its jaw biomechanics revealed that it wasn't a transitional missing link on the way to becoming a modern mammal or reptile. Its jaw was highly specialized for a very specific type of feeding that eventually led to an evolutionary dead end.
So it wasn't a stepping stone, it was a branch that got pruned.
Exactly. It shows that evolution is not a ladder. It is a wildly branching, chaotic, messy tree of genetic experiments. When the new ecological niche of dry land opened up, nature didn't just design one perfect land animal. It threw thousands of bizarre, highly experimental physical architectures against the wall to see what would survive the new pressures of gravity, different oxygen levels, and new food sources. Tanika is a stark reminder that the animals we see on Earth today are simply the descendants of the few random experiments that happened to survive the gauntlet of successive mass extinction events.
A messy tree of genetic experiments. I love that framing. And from the messy evolution of ancient life, let's fast forward to the present day and look at some groundbreaking discoveries about the apex of that evolutionary tree, our own biology. We are seeing massive breakthroughs in how we understand the human body, starting with the brain. A major new study utilizing advanced brain scans has revealed objective evidence of 3 distinct subtypes of ADHD, including a more extreme, previously unmapped form.
This research represents a monumental paradigm shift in psychiatric medicine. For decades, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder has been diagnosed almost exclusively through subjective behavioral observation checklists of symptoms reported by parents, teachers, or the patients themselves. And crucially, the foundational diagnostic criteria for ADHD were developed decades ago based almost entirely on how the disorder presents in hyperactive young boys.
Which means the medical establishment built a net designed to catch one specific type of fish, and a massive demographic of neurodivergent people just swam right through the holes for generations.
Exactly. Women and girls in particular suffered from this diagnostic blind spot. In female patients, ADHD symptoms often present internally as deep inattentiveness, chronic daydreaming, or severe emotional dysregulation, rather than the outward physical hyperactivity seen in boys. Consequently, generations of women were chronically misdiagnosed with anxiety or depression, or simply missed entirely, told they were just unmotivated.
But these new scans change the game.
They do. By utilizing functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, researchers aren't just looking at behavior, they're tracking the actual flow of oxygenated blood in the brain in real time. They are watching the brain wire itself. And these scans identified 3 distinct objective neural pathways, specifically involving how the brain's default mode network communicates with its executive control network that correlate to different presentations of ADHD.
So we are finally moving from a subjective question of how disruptive is this person acting to an objective medical question of how is this specific brain physically processing dopamine and managing attention? That validation must be overwhelming for people who have spent their lives being told their struggles are just a lack of willpower.
It validates their lived experience with hard biological data. And therapeutically, it moves psychiatry closer to the precision of oncology or cardiology. If a doctor can look at an fMRI and identify the specific neural subtype of ADHD a patient has, they can eventually tailor the pharmacological treatment or behavioral therapy specifically to that exact neural pathway, rather than the current, often frustrating trial and error approach with broad-spectrum stimulants.
That is incredible news for millions of people. And moving from the complex wiring of the brain to the complex wiring of the nose, scientists have finally managed to map the physical architecture of our sense of smell. Researchers analyzed 5.5 million individual neurons in mice to discover that the olfactory bulb has a highly ordered geometric structure. It is not the chaotic jumble of nerves we previously thought. Explain this to me, because the sense of smell feels like magic. How does the brain actually take invisible chemical molecules floating in the air and instantly translate them into the vivid emotional memory of a specific smell, like rain on hot asphalt or a fresh cup of coffee?
The translation from chemistry to perception is brilliant. For a long time, the olfactory system was assumed to be somewhat disorganized compared to the visual or auditory cortex. But this new mapping reveals a rigorous spatial logic. Inside your nose, you have millions of sensory neurons equipped with receptors. Think of these receptors as highly specific locks. When you smell coffee, hundreds of different volatile chemical molecules drift into your nose. They act as keys, binding to the specific receptors that match their shape.
Okay, the chemical key fits the biological lock. Then what?
When a lock is turned, that neuron fires an electrical signal up into the olfactory bulb in the brain. The breakthrough of this study is understanding where those signals go. The nerve endings gather in spherical structures called glomeruli. The researchers discovered that these glomeruli are organized in a strict spatial map. When a specific scent molecule binds to a receptor, it sends a signal to an exact, unchanging spatial coordinate in the olfactory bulb.
Like a zip code system for smells.
Precisely. The brain then reads that spatial pattern of activation across the bulb. It's almost like reading a barcode or a QR code. The specific spatial pattern of flashes is what your brain translates into the conscious perception of coffee. This highly ordered spatial map is the computational mechanism that allows mammals to distinguish between tens of thousands of incredibly similar chemical odors with flawless precision.
That is mesmerizing. The brain is reading a barcode drawn by molecules. Okay, now for the medical breakthrough that genuinely made me laugh out loud when I read the science journals this morning. Researchers have discovered a new protein whose specific role in fat metabolism has apparently rewritten decades of established biological science. It turns out that lacking this specific protein causes severe metabolic dysfunction and prevents the body from properly processing lipids. I'm just saying, I finally have peer-reviewed scientific proof to text my doctor about why my diet isn't working. It's not the late-night donuts, Doc. I am simply suffering from an unfortunate deficiency in my fat metabolism protein.
I am sure your doctor will be highly receptive to that novel theory. But joking aside, this discovery really does highlight how profoundly complex and poorly understood human metabolism still is. We tend to think of body fat as just inert, stored energy, but adipose tissue is a highly active, hormonally complex endocrine organ. The storage and release of lipids are governed by intricate cascades of protein signaling.
So what happens when this newly discovered protein is missing?
When those specific protein signals break down or are genetically absent, the fat isn't processed correctly. It can be sequestered harmfully in vital organs like the liver, leading to fatty liver disease, or the body becomes unable to mobilize those stored lipids for energy when needed, leading to severe metabolic exhaustion. Understanding this specific protein pathway opens the door to highly targeted therapies for metabolic syndromes that go far beyond simple caloric restriction.
And speaking of metabolic breakthroughs, the medical reports also highlight a revolutionary new clinical trial for a treatment that cuts LDL, the bad cholesterol, by nearly 50%, and crucially, it does this entirely without the use of statins. Why is a non-statin alternative such a massive deal for cardiology?
Statins are incredibly effective and have saved millions of lives by inhibiting the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme in the liver, which drastically lowers cholesterol production. However, a significant percentage of patients experience severe, debilitating side effects from statins, most commonly severe muscle pain, weakness, and in rare cases, liver damage.
So they are forced to choose between crippling muscle pain or the risk of a heart attack.
Exactly. This new treatment operates on a completely different biological pathway, bypassing the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme entirely. It achieves massive reductions in circulating LDL cholesterol without triggering the muscle toxicity associated with statins. It is a lifeline for patients who are statin intolerant.
And we have one more fascinating medical story, and this one comes from an unexpected source: the cannabis plant. Cultivators of medical and recreational cannabis historically focus entirely on the flowers, the buds, because that is where the highest concentration of THC and CBD is found. The leaves are essentially treated as agricultural waste and thrown away. But researchers have now analyzed those discarded leaves and found they contain rare, highly active compounds with significant medical potential, and crucially, they carry zero intoxicating side effects.
This is a perfect example of the tunnel vision that often plagues pharmacology. Because the market and medical research have been so hyper-focused on the psychoactive and pain-relieving properties of the cannabinoids found in the flower, we ignored the rest of the plant's biochemistry. Plants don't just produce compounds for human benefit, they produce them for their own survival. The leaves of the cannabis plant synthesize entirely different secondary metabolites, often housed in microscopic structures called trichomes, designed to protect the plant from insect herbivores or to act as sunscreen against harsh UV radiation.
And those protective chemicals have human applications.
Absolutely. By isolating these previously ignored compounds, researchers are identifying novel anti-inflammatory agents, potent antioxidants, and potential neuroprotectants. And because these specific metabolites do not interact with the CB1 receptors in the human brain in the same way THC does, they offer the promise of potent cannabis-derived medicines without the psychoactive hurdles or cognitive impairments that complicate current cannabis therapies.
It is amazing what we find when we stop looking exclusively at the products we think we want and just look a little closer at the things we've been throwing away. So, We have looked up at the militarization of the stars, we have zoomed into the quantum realm of levitating atoms, and we have mapped the spatial barcodes of our own brains. Let's finish today's deep dive by zooming back out and looking at the physical planet we live on, because the Earth itself is currently undergoing massive, highly visible, and in some cases violent shifts.
Restless is perhaps the most accurate word to describe the current state of the geosphere. The geological and meteorological phenomena occurring right now are staggering in their sheer scale. We mentioned it briefly at the top of the show, but we need to talk about the fact that Mexico City is sinking. And it is sinking at an alarming, almost incomprehensible rate of 10 inches per year.
10 inches, almost a full foot of subsidence every single year. And reporting confirms this deformation of the Earth's crust is easily visible from satellite telemetry. I honestly cannot even fathom the infrastructure nightmare that causes. Why is the ground falling out from under one of the largest cities in the world?
It is a slow-motion catastrophe born of geography and necessity. Mexico City was originally built by the Aztecs and later expanded by the Spanish on an ancient, drained, high-altitude lake bed. The soil beneath the city isn't solid bedrock. It consists of highly compressible, waterlogged volcanic clay.
Okay, so they built a mega-city on top of a giant wet sponge.
That is exactly what it is. And to supply water to the city's 9 million residents, municipal authorities and private citizens are constantly pumping groundwater out of the vast aquifers trapped within that clay sponge. As the water is violently extracted, the empty pore spaces in the clay collapse under the immense weight of the concrete and steel city above. The sponge compresses and the ground subsides.
So when a sprawling metropolis of 9 million people unevenly sinks a foot a year, what actually happens to the buried infrastructure? What happens to the water pipes, the subways, the foundations of the skyscrapers?
They fracture and shear. The physical stress is immense. Water mains snap, which ironically leads to massive leaks and even worse water scarcity, which forces them to pump even more groundwater. It is a vicious, accelerating feedback loop. The concrete linings of the subway tunnels buckle. Historic cathedrals and centuries-old buildings begin to lean precariously. It is a terrifying, localized warning about the absolute physical limits of human infrastructure when it is fundamentally at odds with the geology it rests upon. The extraction of the resource required to sustain the city is the exact mechanism destroying the physical ground the city stands on.
And while the Earth is quietly, steadily collapsing in Mexico, it is violently exploding elsewhere. The global monitoring agencies report that the Dukono volcano, located on the island of Halmahera in Indonesia, is actively erupting, spewing massive, hazardous ash clouds high into the aviation corridors. Concurrently, Tropical Cyclone Mela, a devastating Category 4 storm, has triggered catastrophic landslides across the mountainous terrain of Papua New Guinea. The sheer, indifferent physical force of the planet is on full display this week. But it's not just the rocks and the weather that are shifting. The biology is adapting in real time to the chaos we create. Look at the wolves in Italy.
This presents a fascinating and highly controversial ecological dilemma. The wildlife reporting highlights that nearly half of the entire wild wolf population in Italy are no longer pure wolves. They are now officially wolf-dog hybrids.
So they're breeding with feral or domestic dogs. Is this the tragic, final destruction of a wild, apex predator species, or is it the rapid, real-time evolution of a species intelligently adapting to survive in a landscape totally dominated by humans?
That is the exact heated debate occurring among evolutionary biologists and conservationists right now. On one side of the argument, you have the purists who point out that this is genetic introgression. We are actively losing the unique, ancient genetic lineage of the pure Apennine wolf. The wild genome is being irrevocably diluted.
But what is the counterargument?
The counterargument is survival at any cost. Wild wolves face extreme habitat fragmentation, constant encroachment by human agriculture, and historical persecution. By interbreeding with feral dogs, these wolf populations are acquiring new genes that might make them significantly more tolerant of human environments. They might develop digestive enzymes better suited to processing human food waste found in garbage dumps. They are actively becoming synanthropes, which are wild animals that uniquely benefit from living in close proximity to humans, like raccoons or pigeons. It is evolution happening not over the glacial pace of millions of years, but over a few short decades, driven entirely by the pressure of human architecture.
Our architecture is literally reshaping their DNA. We pave a road, and their genome alters to survive the traffic. And speaking of adapting to human architecture, I am both fascinated and deeply terrified by the biological discovery reported out of Argentina this week. Scientists have officially classified a new species of spider, playfully named the Pink Floyd spider, or formerly Picolinia floyd-moraria. This spider lives entirely within the crevices of urban brick walls and has been observed hunting and killing prey 6 times its own size. It has completely, flawlessly adapted its hunting strategies to the vertical, synthetic, man-made environment we built.
It is a slightly unsettling thought, but it proves the biological axiom that nature abhors a vacuum. We clear-cut a forest and build a dense concrete and brick jungle in its place. And nature doesn't just surrender, it immediately begins iterating, designing new predators uniquely suited to hunt on the sheer cliff faces of our brick apartment buildings. The spider doesn't know it's a city, it just knows it's a new topography waiting to be conquered.
Okay, I'm going to need a serious mental palate cleanser after the vivid image of massive, hyper-evolved urban wall spiders lurking in the bricks. And thankfully, the nature journals provided a beautiful one to end on. In the shallow tidal flats of the Indo-Pacific, researchers are documenting the behavior of tiny crustaceans called sand bubbler crabs. At low tide, these tiny crabs emerge and begin etching these perfect, complex, spiraling geometric patterns into the wet sand. They make these massive, intricate designs that cover the beaches, only for the patterns to be completely washed away a few hours later by the returning advancing tide. It's like they're creating natural transient mandalas.
It is a remarkable, highly efficient foraging behavior. The crabs are sifting the top layer of sand for microscopic organic detritus. They scrape the sand, eat the microbes, and then meticulously pack the clean, discarded sand into perfect little spheres, placing them behind them as they work outward in a radial pattern from their burrow to avoid searching the same sand twice. But yes, aesthetically, it is a stunning process. It is a beautiful reminder of the transient, ephemeral art of the natural world, which stands in incredibly sharp contrast to the permanent concrete, steel, and orbital weapons we try so desperately to impose upon it.
It really is. The crab builds a masterpiece that it knows the ocean will erase in an hour, while we sink a city trying to make it last forever. Okay, let's bring this all together. What a sprawling, incredible journey today has been. We started by looking at a fragile global economy, propped up by the sheer gravity of artificial intelligence investments, but actively threatened by geopolitical conflict and the very real chemical risk to the global fertilizer supply chain. We explored the invisible digital borders closing around us as the United States and China fight over AI knowledge distillation and firmware testing. We looked up at the Space Force's plans for a golden dome of orbital interceptors, and we looked down through microscopes at the triangular molecular structures of engineered aluminum and the probability spaces of levitating atoms. We rewrote the historical timeline of Roman plaster and remapped the spatial zip codes of the human brain. And we ended by watching Mexico City sink into the earth while wolves and spiders adapt to the concrete we leave behind.
It is a massive amount of information to process. But if there is a single unifying thread connecting all of this, from the fierce AI arms race and the intricacies of knowledge distillation, all the way back to the Neolithic communities firing plaster in 8000 BCE, it is the relentless, defining human drive to manipulate our environment, to impose order on that chaotic map we talked about at the very beginning. But consider the Pink Floyd spider flawlessly adjusting to the brick walls of our cities, or the wolves mixing their genetics with our domestic dogs just to survive our expansion. As we humans race to build artificial superintelligence, as we launch interceptor rockets into the vacuum of orbit, and as we fight bitter wars over rare earth metals and natural gas, nature is not just sitting still playing the victim. It is quietly, persistently, and brilliantly adapting to the architecture of our modern world. So the provocative question I want to leave you with is this. Are we actually successfully conquering nature with all of our brilliant technology, or is nature simply finding entirely new, highly efficient ways to use us and our concrete and our cities as just another part of its ever-expanding ecosystem?
Man, that is a thought that is going to stick with me for a long time. Is the brick wall actually ours, or do we just expend all that energy building a brand new hunting ground for the spider? When you look at the map of the world now, you realize the borders aren't just blurring between rival countries or competing technologies. They are blurring between us and the natural world we arrogantly think we've paved over. The X-ray machine of global news isn't broken. It's just showing us a picture of ourselves we didn't expect to see. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning what you see on the map. Keep exploring the hidden connections between the headlines. And most importantly, stay curious. We will see you next time.
For enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to the debate. So right now, global stock markets are they're hitting record highs. We're seeing trillions of dollars pouring into artificial intelligence and, the broader tech sectors.
But simultaneously, there's a massive fertilizer crisis.
Exactly, a crisis triggered directly by the escalating conflicts in the Middle East, specifically Iran, which is quite literally threatening to wipe out 10 billion human meals a week.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
It is. So I want to start by asking a very simple question today. How can the financial world be thriving so spectacularly while, the physical world fractures so completely?
Well, the short answer is because they are completely divorced from one another at this point. We really like to pretend the ground beneath our feet is stable. But right now, the global architecture is undergoing a massive seismic event. And frankly, half the world is just trying to ignore the tremors.
Right. We are looking at a planet that is rapidly and then in many ways very ruthlessly restructuring itself. The shockwaves radiating from the war in Iran are accelerating shifts across every continent, not just the West.
Oh, absolutely.
Examining a series of global reports that present a profound paradox. We have record-high stock markets contrasting with severe global energy shocks. We're seeing the fracturing of traditional Middle Eastern oil alliances, a very pragmatic pivot toward Africa, and rising domestic unrest everywhere, from Latin America to Europe.
It's a staggering amount of data to process.
Yeah, it really is.
And the contradictions within that data are exactly what we need to unpack today. Because those contradictions, they're hiding a crisis. To state where I'm coming from clearly, the current global trajectory is a dangerous illusion of resilience that is rapidly dismantling the institutions keeping us safe.
And to frame where I stand on this, I see a global system undergoing a painful but ultimately successful adaptation through pragmatic, decentralized realignment.
Well, we certainly disagree on the successful part.
Right, well, let me explain why I see it that way. I look at this data and see rapid structural innovation. Yes, obviously the Iran war has pushed oil to a 4-year high. That hurts. But the global economy is showing remarkable resilience.
Is it, though?
It is. That resilience is being driven by massive capital investments in AI, a necessary decentralization of energy markets, most notably, the UAE's exit from OPEC, and a very pragmatic shift away from paralyzed multilateral institutions toward realistic, bilateral trade and national security policies. The system is bending, sure, but it is fundamentally not breaking.
I look at the exact same data, and I see a system that is fundamentally breaking.
How so?
What you are calling resilience is it's an artificial high. It's masking a catastrophic breakdown of global stability. The stock market is soaring, sure, but the fracturing of the global order is threatening fundamental human survival.
I think that's a bit hyperbolic.
It's really not. We have severe fertilizer shortages. We are seeing the erosion of international alliances that have kept the peace for 80 years. We are watching a really dangerous rise in authoritarian domestic policies and labor unrest across the entire globe. You are basically mistaking the fever for the cure.
Okay, let's dive right into that paradox then. The conflict between economic resilience and systemic fragility. The energy and market shock, the U.S. economy just posted a rebound with 2% growth in the first quarter.
Right.
And it's not just a modest recovery either. The capital markets are absolutely roaring. The NASDAQ and the S&P 500 just finished their best months since 2020.
Yeah, the S&P closed at a record high above 7,200.
Exactly. So what the data tells us is that technology, particularly the boom in artificial intelligence investments, combined with targeted government spending, is successfully buffering the geopolitical shock of the Iran conflict. Capital is finding efficient harbors.
But you have to look at what that capital is actually doing. And, more importantly, how it is operating. It is retreating into highly insulated sectors.
Insulated from what, exactly?
From the physical world. When physical shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea are compromised by Middle East conflict, institutional capital realizes it can't no longer rely on atoms. It can't rely on physical goods. So it flees to bytes.
Well, sure, it seeks digital safety.
Right, but AI investments are a massive capital sink that is entirely immune to a blocked strait in the Gulf. That is how your buffer works. It protects the investor class while the physical economy, the one that relies on actual materials, is suffocating.
But that capital flight into digital infrastructure is what keeps the broader financial system from collapsing under the weight of these physical shocks. It's a net positive.
It is an illusion of stability. It entirely ignores the devastating impact on the working class and the developing world. Consider the stark warning from Yara International.
The fertilizer company?
Yes. Their CEO just explicitly stated that the war has caused a massive fertilizer shortage. Let's look at the mechanism here because it's important. Natural gas is the primary feedstock for creating ammonia, right?
Right, which is the base of nitrogen fertilizers.
Exactly. So, with the energy crisis triggered by the Iran conflict, natural gas prices have just absolutely spiked, and these fertilizer plants simply cannot afford to operate.
They're shutting down.
They are shutting down. He estimates that this shortage puts 10 billion meals a week at risk globally. 10 billion meals. You cannot feed a population in Latin America or Africa with a rising S&P 500.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Think of the global economy right now like a shock-absorbing skyscraper in a severe earthquake.
Okay.
The foundation, which is the physical energy markets and commodity supply chains, is absolutely shaking. We agree on that. But the upper floors, represented by the tech sector, AI innovation, and these agile capital markets, they are engineered to sway.
Swaying while the bottom crumbles?
The energy from the earthquake is absorbed by the movement of those upper floors, so the building doesn't snap. The fact that the financial architecture hasn't collapsed under the weight of a Middle Eastern war that has pushed oil to a 4-year high, well, that proves that the system's engineering actually works.
I mean,
It is buying us the time and the capital needed to innovate our way out of the underlying physical shortages.
I don't think your skyscraper analogy holds up when the people living on the ground floor are being crushed by falling debris.
And that's a bit dramatic.
It's the reality. Look at the monetary policy response. The Bank of England just decided to hold interest rates at 3.75%. Why? Not because they think the economy is incredibly robust, but out of sheer fear.
Fear of imported inflation.
Yes, they understand the mechanism of imported inflation. When the Middle East disruptions cause the cost of basic logistics and heating to skyrocket, that inflation bleeds directly into the UK economy. They are holding rates steady because they are terrified that this imported inflation is going to completely hollow out household budgets. The working class pays the price regardless of whether a tech firm in Silicon Valley hits a $1 trillion valuation.
Look, the central banks are acting cautiously, which is exactly their mandate. But the reason the capital markets are seeing safe harbors in tech is exactly because of what's happening at the base level of the economy. Energy, which really brings us to the structural changes happening in the physical market.
The fracturing of the traditional alliances.
Right. The fracturing of traditional oil cartels. We are seeing the UAE's recent exit from OPEC. For decades, OPEC has operated as a monopolistic cartel, manipulating supply to prop up prices.
Well,
let me just say, the UAE leaving is a positive, necessary market correction. It immediately frees up 1 million barrels of spare capacity that they were previously holding back.
I come at it from a totally different way. The UAE's exit from OPEC is not a triumph of the free market. It is a dangerous destabilizer.
How is adding 1 million barrels of capacity dangerous?
Because OPEC, for all its massive flaws, provided a mechanism for market predictability. When a major player like the UAE decides to prioritize its immediate national interests over collective agreements, it signals to the rest of the world that it is, every nation for itself.
Which it kind of is right now.
But if countries like Kazakhstan and Venezuela follow suit, which analysts are now predicting they will, OPEC's inability to stabilize prices will lead to extreme, chaotic volatility.
I understand the fear of price volatility, but I have to admit I'm confused by your defense of a cartel.
I'm not defending a cartel, I'm defending stability.
But hasn't relying on a centralized monopoly like OPEC always been our greatest systemic vulnerability? Walk me through why a fragmented free market in oil is somehow worse.
Because energy isn't just another commodity, it is the prerequisite for civilization. When OPEC coordinates production cuts or increases, they are effectively acting as a central bank for oil. They smooth out the massive peaks and valleys.
At the expense of consumers.
But when the market turns into a free-for-all, developing nations are the ones who get hurt the most. They lack the capital reserves to weather massive price spikes. When energy volatility hits, A country struggling with its sovereign debt can't secure affordable fuel,
Right.
which means their own agricultural and manufacturing sectors just grind to a halt.
Think of OPEC like a single massive dam. A dam creates a beautifully stable reservoir, right? Very predictable. But if a geopolitical crack forms in that single dam, say a massive conflict involving major OPEC members, everyone downstream drowns.
That's a big if.
It's happening right now. Decentralized markets are like a network of smaller streams. Yes, the water level fluctuates, it's volatile, but a blockage in one stream doesn't cause a catastrophic global flood.
But it does cause localized droughts.
The UAE has invested heavily in maximizing its production efficiency. Why should they be forced to constrain their output to subsidize less efficient states? Breaking up the cartel brings competitive pricing back to the forefront and reduces the leverage that bad actors have over the global economy.
Because an unregulated river system floods the villages downstream before they can build higher banks. Stability matters just as much as efficiency, and this fragmentation in the energy sector, it isn't happening in a vacuum.
No, it's planetary.
Exactly. It is mirroring a much larger and far more alarming planetary shift. We are watching the complete erosion of post-World War II multilateralism in favor of transactional, bilateral geopolitics.
Which is a necessary evolution.
No. The institutions that were built to prevent global conflicts are being actively dismantled.
I would argue they are dismantling themselves through their own paralysis.
They are being starved of cooperation. Look at the diplomatic maneuvers happening right now. We have former President Trump openly proposing to reduce U.S. troops in Germany.
Which is a bilateral pressure tactic.
But it shakes the entire foundation of European security and NATO. At the same time, he is engaging in direct talks with Vladimir Putin, attempting to strike a deal regarding Eastern Europe without actually involving Ukraine.
The so-called spirit of anchorage.
Yes. This new willingness of superpowers to just bypass allied consensus and strike unilateral backroom bargains, it is a complete circumvention of international norms.
But those norms are failing us.
Let me finish the thought, because it's not just NATO. Look at the United Nations. The political affairs chief, Rosemary DiCarlo, just delivered a terrifying warning to the Security Council. North Korea is continuing its unchecked nuclear militarization.
Right.
And you know exactly how they are getting away with it? Because Russia utilized its veto power to shut down the UN panel of experts that was monitoring those sanctions. Russia effectively blinded the international community to secure artillery from Pyongyang.
Right, which proves my point.
The UN is losing its grip because major powers are actively sabotaging its mechanisms.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because clinging to the UN or outdated NATO structures is like refusing to abandon a sinking ship just because you helped build it.
They aren't sinking, they are being torpedoed.
Those institutions were designed for a bipolar Cold War world that no longer exists. What you call sabotage, I call geopolitical pragmatism. The UN Security Council is structurally paralyzed by the veto power. Any one of the 5 permanent members can halt any action.
Which was designed to prevent world war.
But now it cannot solve the North Korean nuclear issue, and it certainly cannot solve the Iran conflict. Bilateral diplomacy and strategic economic statecraft are the new reality because they actually yield results. Faster, more direct results.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Bilateral deals are not lifeboats for everyone. They are lifeboats only for those with the economic and military strength to row them.
That's not true.
It is true. Everyone else is left to drown. When you replace multilateral, rules-based institutions with pure transactional power politics, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. There is no international law protecting a developing nation in a purely bilateral negotiation with a superpower.
But the weak are actually benefiting from these new arrangements when they are structured correctly. Let's look at how this works in practice.
Okay, give me an example.
Take China's recent statecraft in Africa. They just implemented a zero-tariff policy for 20 middle-income African countries. This covers vital export goods like cocoa, coffee, and wine.
Okay.
Do you know how long it takes to negotiate a multi-nation tariff reduction through the World Trade Organization? Decades. It is endlessly cumbersome.
Because it requires consensus?
But through direct bilateral economic statecraft, China bypassed the WTO entirely. They immediately secure their supply chains, and simultaneously provided instant economic uplift for those African nations. Bilateral deals, however messy they seem to institutionalists, are the lifeboats actually keeping global trade afloat right now.
Now, come on. That zero tariff policy is a strategic play for geopolitical leverage, not a charitable act.
I didn't say it was charity, it's mutual interest.
China is locking those nations into its sphere of influence. And the cost of this global fracturing, this shift to every nation for itself, is not just felt in trade deficits or energy prices. It is bleeding directly into domestic politics.
You mean the protests?
Yes, these geopolitical tectonic shifts are rupturing the ground domestically. The global conflict is manifesting on the ground as a crisis of democracy and civil liberties all over the world.
Look, whenever you rewire the global economy, people are going to get hurt in the short term. Economic transitions always cause labor friction.
It is so much more than friction. Just look at the International Labor Day protests. May Day protests erupted all over the globe, from Istanbul to Argentina to Venezuela. Millions of workers took to the streets.
Because of inflation.
Exactly. Because the inflation and the cost of living driven directly by these geopolitical energy shocks we're discussing are crushing them. And governments are using this global chaos as an excuse to crush dissent and consolidate power.
How so?
Maintaining public order during an economic crisis is standard statecraft.
It goes far beyond maintaining order. India is currently prototyping a dangerous new model of web censorship. They're using the pretense of maintaining public order amid global tensions to control digital narratives and silence domestic opposition.
Well,
And meanwhile, in Europe, the UK has just raised its terrorism threat level to severe following the horrific anti-Semitic stabbings of 2 Jewish men in Golders Green. The Home Secretary's terror advisor actually called the rise in anti-Semitism a national security emergency.
Which it is.
Yes, but we are seeing imported geopolitical hatred making the streets unsafe, and in response, states are adopting authoritarian measures that marginalize minorities and crush fundamental rights. They use the global chaos to justify the iron fist at home.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently.
I'm sure you would.
What you are labeling as authoritarianism is, in many cases, necessary state resilience in an increasingly hostile, multipolar world. Robust security measures are the immune response of a sovereign state.
An immune response?
Yes. You cannot maintain a free society if your streets are unsafe due to imported geopolitical hatred, or if your digital networks are fundamentally compromised by foreign adversaries.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that an overactive immune system is what causes an autoimmune disease?
That's a clever counter.
It's true. When the state's security apparatus becomes so aggressive that it starts attacking its own democratic principles, it destroys the very society it claims to be protecting. When India censors the web, it isn't protecting democracy from foreign influence, it is insulating the ruling party from domestic criticism. It is an autoimmune response.
There is a delicate balance to be struck, certainly. But let's look at the mechanics of national security in this new era. Consider the actions of the U.S. Federal Communications Commission.
The FCC bans.
Right, the FCC just voted unanimously to ban Chinese labs from testing U.S. electronics, and they are barring Chinese telecoms like China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom from operating data centers in the United States.
Which further fractures the global tech ecosystem.
But look at why they did it. 75% of U.S. electronics were previously being tested in China. Think about the vulnerability there.
It's a supply chain reality.
When a foreign lab tests your hardware, they have the opportunity to embed backdoors, monitor data flows, and map your infrastructure. In a world where supply chains are explicitly weaponized, relying on a strategic rival to test your communications hardware is an unacceptable vulnerability.
I'm not saying there isn't risk.
Asserting control over your national infrastructure and physical security from foreign espionage isn't authoritarianism. It is the absolute primary duty of the state. If you don't secure the hardware in the data centers, sovereignty is just an illusion.
Securing hardware is one thing, but when the rhetoric of national security is used to justify the erosion of civil liberties and the abandonment of the international community, we cross a very dangerous line.
We're not abandoning the community.
We are. The problem with relying purely on state power and bilateral transactionalism is that there are no guardrails left. When the UN is bypassed, when OPEC is shattered, when the WTO is ignored, we are stripping away the very mechanisms that force nations to consider the global human impact of their actions.
Those mechanisms weren't working anyway.
But the resulting inflation, the fertilizer shortages, the massive potential for famine, these are the direct mechanical consequences of a world that has decided to abandon cooperation for competition.
We haven't abandoned cooperation. We've simply changed the venue. Cooperation is now happening between aligned partners who share mutual strategic interests, rather than through bloated global assemblies where adversaries simply veto each other into total paralyses.
So, cooperation only for the rich and aligned?
The transition is undeniably rough. The global system is moving from a unipolar, hyper-globalized model to a decentralized, technologically fortified framework. National sovereignty and market adaptability, like the agile capital markets we discussed earlier, are what will ultimately secure stability.
I maintain that the stability you see in the capital markets is a dangerous illusion. It is a financial resilience that completely ignores the material reality of billions of people.
I hear that.
If we continue on this trajectory, prioritizing transactional deals and state security over humanitarian cooperation and international law, we risk exacerbating global inequality to a breaking point. We are risking mass famine in the global south due to agricultural supply shocks, and we are dismantling the institutional guardrails that were specifically designed to prevent regional conflicts, like the escalating war in Iran, from spiraling into a broader global conflagration.
Well, while we clearly view the mechanisms of this transition through very different lenses, there is a point of convergence here. We both recognize that the era of uncontested utopian globalization is permanently over.
Oh, entirely over.
The escalating conflict in Iran, the massive shifts in energy policy, the rise of bilateral statecraft, these are not temporary anomalies that will eventually smooth out. They're the accelerants of a permanent restructuring of the planetary economy.
Agreed. The old order is gone. The illusion that we are all on the same page has evaporated, and the new world order is being forged right now, for better or worse.
To me, what this all points to is a fascinating yet terrifying new paradigm. We aren't just seeing a shift in geopolitical power. We are witnessing a fundamental divorce between the physical world and the digital financial world.
Right.
The capital markets have figured out how to survive and even thrive without relying on the physical supply chain. That resilience is incredible, but as we've discussed today, it is exactly what makes this era so uniquely dangerous for the billions of people who still rely on the physical world to eat, to heat their homes, and to survive.
And that is the paradox we all have to live within now.
It is. There is a vast amount of complexity in the material we've covered today, and we've only just scratched the surface of how these geopolitical mechanisms will impact our daily lives. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh these perspectives and examine the evidence for yourself. Think back to those tectonic plates. The pressure has been building for decades, and the fault lines are finally snapping. The question now is whether the new landscape that emerges will be strong enough to support the future, or if we are just waiting for the next massive tremor.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.